The exhibition tries to look at the extraordinary year 2003 in the history of Hong Kong, where a number of events overlapped, coincided and influenced each other and caused tremendous effects in the culture and recent history of the city. We're talking, of course, about the SARS crisis that affected the city in the spring of that year, that coincided with the suicide of pop icon Leslie Cheung. What we're very interested with this exhibition, however, is to look at the background of these events and particularly the consequences of these events. Because SARS was not just an epidemic, no matter how tragic and scary it was at the time. It had very concrete consequences for the history of Hong Kong, and it also had a history, because Hong Kong is not foreign to epidemics. In the 19th century, in the first phase of the colonial history of the city, it was considered to be one of the most infected colonies of the British Empire. And the climax of this prejudices of Hong Kong about Hong Kong were reached at the turn of the last century, when in 1894 there was one of the last major plague epidemics in the world happened in Hong Kong, here in Taiping San neighborhood where we are with Parasite. And the actual bacillus that causes the plague was discovered during these epidemics in Hong Kong. So all of a sudden, Hong Kong featured very prominently in this otherwise very long, millennia-long history of the plague. And there was always an association between the plague and, the others, be it the Mongols, be it the Jews, be it always the foreigners who were bringing the disease into Europe, but that was never. But the actual cause of the disease was never really proven until the bacillus was discovered here in Hong Kong, and that caused in Europe, in North America, a huge amplification of something that was already in the air, a fear towards Asians. That is known under the term yellow peril, that had different causes and different manifestations. There was a fear on the rise of Japan as a great power. There was a fear of the Chinese for their sheer numbers. There was a fear that is still very, very actual today of the Chinese as taking the jobs, the cheap jobs from the regular Americans and the South Africans. Not so much within China, but as immigrants in those countries. So there is this very strong history linking an epidemics, a fear of a germ, and a fear of the other, of a foreigner that infects a social body.
Very important that to note that the exhibition does not solely explore the history of this epidemics, which is something that is an interest of the exhibition, but it kind of reverberates on the different cultural epidemics or the symbolic values of thinking what could be epidemics today. Somehow the fear, not for a health issue, but the fear towards difference, the fear of others, has caused actually a lot of xenophobia in different parts of the world. And we would like to actually make this link that perhaps the fear for that alterity can also be in the same rhetoric of the way that any plague manifested in history. So today in Hong Kong, there's clearly some kind of fear towards the mainland Chinese, seen as somehow a sort of plague that was once portrayed as locusts, like last year. And how could they actually come and take all the resources and manifest in a way like a plague?
And there are several artists in the exhibition that will directly talk about that. We have a new project by Ai Weiwei that tries to look at one of the hysterias within this wider issue of xenophobia, that is the infamous milk formula issue, the fact that mainland Chinese cannot take out of Hong Kong more than 1.8 kilos of milk powder per person, which is probably one of the most ironic things in the economic history of Hong Kong, the freest considered to be economy in the world, where you can sell and buy everything, you can take everything you want in and out of Hong Kong, except more than 1.8 kilograms of milk powder. There's another consequence, however, of SARS, one that is perhaps more of a moment of grace, because that extreme sense of fear and of social isolation and of atomization in this quarantine that was imposed during SARS also had the opposite effect, and it, rather than just isolating people, it also brought Hong Kongers together. Now, the second important part of the exhibition, almost the second chapter, although the ideas are very much intertwined, as they actually were at the time. Because there are two histories that come in this exhibition because they simply happen in the same time. That's why the name that borrows the title of a book by Daniel Defoe that talks about a previous plague epidemics in London, and it captures a lot of the actual phenomena that you know, always happen in times of great fear for humanity. So it happened then, it happened in Hong Kong, and it happened innumerable times previously and afterwards. What happened at the height of the SARS epidemics was the suicide of Leslie Cheung. And it is very difficult to understate the position that the figure of Leslie Cheung has, particularly in Hong Kong, but you know, wider throughout Asia, as one of the first Pan-Asian pop stars, somebody whose persona contributed hugely at the creation of a Hong Kong cultural identity, of somebody that distinguished culturally Hong Kong within the rest of Asia. In a way, somebody who was used in this very complex process of transition of identity that Hong Kong has experienced in the last 25 years, you know, from before the Sino-British agreement to the period leading to the handover in which Farewell My Concubine and his appearance in that film was somehow decisive to bring a certain kind of Hong Kong pop culture within the grand narrative of traditional Chinese culture to the period after the handover and so on. So in a way, the changing costumes and identities of Leslie Cheung is the story of the changing identities and colors of Hong Kong. And we have a lot of artists who deal with this in a brilliant way. We have new works by Lee Kit, who's trying to bring together all these issues and a very Hong Kong sense of melancholy at the death of Leslie Cheung through a new piece, through a new karaoke video.
In the exhibition, there are going to be also artists from other contexts that will relate symbolically and indirectly to these issues on collectivity and on sociability, but perhaps with more abstract imagery. You know? So there's, for example, an artist from Brazil from the 1960s and 70s called Lija Pape, whose work will be represented through the reenactment of a seminal performance from the 1960s, where 65 participants are all within a huge white piece of cloth. Their heads are popping out of this piece of cloth, and they move in the street on a specific urban area, and everybody's struggling somehow for their individuality, but they understand that the whole composition will depend on them. So there is a notion of the collective, and at the same time all being addressed by individual gestures. Within the exhibition, we've also included an iconic reference for contemporary art here in Hong Kong, Ricky Young, who in 1987 did an amazing performance reacting directly to what was a moment of the official signing of the handover that would occur 10 years after. The fears, the anxieties that were basically in the psychology of many people back then somehow were the main point of departure of this artist who stayed for 48 hours inside a cage with all the implications of his own fear, his own rejection, his own madness over what would become a very turmoil period.
So all in all, it's a very complex exhibition with lots of great artists, both from Hong Kong, from China, and internationally. There will be lots of events happening, in the city, as we mentioned, at a few off-sites. So we invite everyone to come and to participate in this discussion that, again, is not just about the issues and it's not about artists, it's also about, the wider community in Hong Kong.